Hello, class. This is week 11 now, so coming up to the end of the semester. I've heard from several of you about various circumstances with regards to family and health. So I'm very willing to be flexible, and of course, just let me know what I can do. For any of you who have questions about upcoming projects or assignments, you of course can also email me, and we'll figure out how to end the semester strongly. We're sort of shifting gears now from Hickson's American settler colonialism to Lorenzo Verasini's uh, settler colonial um, settler colonial theories, and in doing so, we're sort of like moving away from this sort of U.S. focused, history focused approach to settler colonial studies to what, for me, is much more of a theoretical and philosophical approach to settler colonialism. I think that as we begin talking about settler colonialism, this first half of the lecture today will talk a little bit about how settler colonialism is different from other forms of colonialism. It's also different from migration. But then I'll also describe a little bit about modes of production. In the second video, I'm going to sort of preview chapter one, just given that the vocabulary in chapter one is a little bit difficult to follow, and if I can maybe provide some of that up front, then hopefully when you do get through chapter one, you'll be able to pick up on the notion of population production. So in the introduction chapter, Verasini starts with this distinction between what a colonizer is and what a settler colonizer is, and of course distinguishing both of those from what a migrant is. A couple of important ideas to really just break down Verasini is thinking that like the migrant and the colonizer and the settler colonizer are all exogenous. He makes the distinction from indigenous and exogenous. Indigenous being folks who are native to a land, and exogenous being peoples who come from another land to reproduce and recreate, um, you know, uh, people. Essentially, this idea is a characteristic of all three groups: migrants, imperial colonizers, and settler colonizers. The distinction then from migrants and colonizers, both settler and imperial, is that while colonizers bring a particular sort of political and economic order with them and try to establish that order in the areas in which they're migrating to, migrants typically buy into the political order that's already established. This is a very important distinction, given that in many cases there's often this mischaracterization of the early settlers as the first illegal immigrants or somehow part of the immigrant class, and even the slogan that used to be associated with our nation's Statue of Liberty, the idea that we're a nation of immigrants, isn't quite true. It's not characteristic of the actual history of settler colonialism, which is distinct. So the difference between colonizers, imperial colonizers, and the settler colonizers is that while imperial colonizers bring a certain sovereignty that's loyal to the original imperial state, whether it's Britain, France, Spain, in the context of North America, this is not true of the settler colonizer. The settler colonizer wishes to establish an entirely new political order, completely separate from the imperial order, completely replacing the already established native indigenous political order. And in doing so, it must do a very careful sort of production balance around things like sovereignty, populations, and of course consciousness. These are all things that we'll be talking about in this book. But of primary importance here to me is then how do we talk about settlers and settler colonialism without trying to generalize too much. And I think what Verasini's argument in the first chapter, the introduction chapter is that we have to take each sort of like settler colonial experience individually, locally, and really explore its nuances. Every sort of aspect of colonialism isn't the same. And especially in the United States, we can see that different colonialisms happened at different times. The states became colonized at different points. Native peoples from the east to the west were eradicated and subjugated at different times. And each one of these happened with a different set of sort of like technological powers. We also see how the ramifications of U.S. colonialism impede in other colonialisms throughout Latin America, through Hawaii, through other places of the world today. And this to me is really giving complexity to the understanding and the study of settler colonialism. So again, in previewing the rest of the book, we see that Verratini focuses on four primary modes of production, which are associated with settler colonialism: population production, sovereignty production, consciousness production, and narrative production. Narrative production, for me, is the most relevant to our study of settler colonialism and communication studies, because it really ties into this idea that narrative, for one, has power. Narrative, two, also has the capacity to culturally modify the way we understand history. And if that's the case, then the third premise that I'm about to state, that our settler colonial present has sort of been masked by narratives of American exceptionalism and of U.S. Historical asymmetry with regard to its relationship to Native peoples, then we can start to see how our current cultural conditions are roadmapped by settler colonialism, and more attention to those sort of mappings is necessary. So, like I said, in the next part of the video, I will preview chapter 1 and try to give us a sense of how this is going to fit. And of course, I'll give you your question of the week.